Welcome. My name is Julia Sullivan. I'm an MBA 82, and I will be facilitating the session that we're having today for the GSB Leading in a Pandemic series. And this one is very exciting, talking about equipping youth with hope and opportunity, which I think is even especially relevant given everything that's happening in our country and the world on top of the pandemic. So we have 3 social innovation fellows who will be speaking with us today. Christina Guilbeau, Claire Fisher, and Jenna Nicholas are 3 social innovation fellows from the GSB, and Chris Bischof, who is a Stanford grad, will also be joining us and talk to us about Eastside College Prep. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. The purpose of this series was to showcase and let the GSB community know, as well as students and admits, what GSB alums are doing in the face of the pandemic. And we were hoping that by hearing some of this action that people are taking, that the alumni base overall and anybody else who would hear this recording would be able to know how to plug in, reinforce, join forces with, contribute to, in any way possible, these efforts that are going on across so many disciplines and domains. Ultimately, we're wanting these sessions to bring hope and optimism because we are facing unprecedented, I think, challenges as a globe and now as a community and as a society. And so to be able to hear ways to plug in and truly make a huge impact, I think is very important, and that's our purpose. Starting with Christina, who is the founder of Hopebound. We'll be hearing from Chris, who will talk to us about Eastside College Prep. Then we will go on to Claire, who will talk about the arena. And then Jenna will talk about impact experience and especially in particular, their work with the Steve Fund. Okay, so with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Christina, who first of all will begin by explaining to us what a social innovation fellow is and how you came to be a recipient and a little bit more about that. And if you want more information, of course, there's more on the GSB website, but there are some alums on the call today who may not know what that is. So Christina, start with that and then talk about your organization.
Great, thanks so much, Julia. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. And as Julia mentioned, I'm a Stanford Social Innovation Fellow. And what that is it is a year-long fellowship that comes out of the Stanford GSB's Center for Social Innovation. And this fellowship has been taking place for 10 years now, this year. And the Center for Social Innovation, along with 2 panels of judges, selects 2 organizations each year. And up until 2019, every organization was a nonprofit. Starting this year in 2020, they're also supporting for-profits as well, or social enterprises. But essentially, these 2 leaders who are chosen are empowered to launch their own organization with funding and support from the Center for Social Innovation. So myself, I'm a 2019 Stanford Social Innovation Fellow, Claire is a 2018, and Jenna is a 2017 Fellow. And we've each had the pleasure of having Amanda Greco as our advisor, who's just wonderful. She's fabulous. But in addition to the funding, we get advisory support from Amanda and just access to a lot of different resources to really ensure that we have the support to launch our organization. So it's a really wonderful opportunity.
Great.
And also just to kick off the fireside chat, as I mentioned, I'm a 2019 alumna, and through the Stanford Social Innovation Fellowship, I launched Hopebound. So what Hopebound's mission is to make mental health support more accessible to adolescents. And we do that by connecting budget-constrained organizations that serve adolescents, so public middle schools or high schools or after-school programs, with master's and doctorate level mental health clinicians who are earning their hours to become fully certified as mental health professionals. And we focus on particularly vulnerable adolescents. So that could be adolescents of color, low-income adolescents, LGBTQIA adolescents, those who are experiencing homelessness, those who may be in the foster care system, or those who may be in the juvenile justice system, for example. Those are just some of the examples of the youth that we focus on. But one note that I want to make is before COVID, the idea and the model was always to connect the adolescents with their counselors virtually. And that was mainly because of what I mentioned earlier, because of accessibility. Oftentimes it can be, you know, hundreds of miles between a school in need and maybe a university that has students that can help with providing counseling. And research actually shows that youth of the current generation prefer virtual connection. It will be interesting to see how that shifts now that all of us have been forced to connect in this way, but it's also more cost effective as well. So it's convenient, more accessible, and more cost effective to connect virtually. So it's really interesting because I am, you know, the most newly minted entrepreneur on the panel, and it turns out that Hopebound actually launched in terms of starting to serve students during coronavirus, during COVID-19, and when the pandemic really, you know, started taking place in the United States. And what's really interesting is that the original model was for it to be school-based. So I wanted to meet kids where they were at school, have them go into a private room during a free period, and be able to log into the software and connect with their counselor that way. And I had several reasons for wanting to do that. But in early March, as I was getting ready to kick that off, we learned that school would no longer be in session. And if you can remember, at that point, it was believed to maybe be 2 weeks that school would be out, then we would go back, everyone would go back to work. Of course, little did we know what would take place. But what's interesting is at that point, I thought, okay, schools' priorities are really shifting right now. They're trying to shift to distance learning. They're trying to keep track of all their students. I don't want to add another burden of having them, you know, trying to onboard this new system. I'll just press pause, and then in a few weeks, everything will be back to normal, and it's fine. But I want to credit my younger brother, who's helped me a ton with Hopebound, and he pushed me and he said, there is going to be a real need. You need to just figure it out some way. Maybe you shouldn't go through schools, but figure it out. So fast forward a few weeks later, I was literally putting up flyers at the local gas stations or local stores throughout Atlanta. That was something else I didn't mention, that I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. And posting on Facebook groups for parents, you know, posting on Nextdoor, things like that, and was able to recruit over 20 kids to participate in Hopebound's pilot. I also had some of my fellow classmates who live in the Atlanta area reach out to family and friends who they thought may be interested. So now that I am about 5 weeks into having 5 masters in counseling interns here in Georgia serve these 20 kids that I mentioned, it's been really interesting to observe how COVID-19 has impacted the services. So for one, and I think this is definitely stating the obvious, but the need is certainly greater, just given the isolation that we are all experiencing and the fact that anxiety and depression and even suicidal ideation is all on the rise right now. But particularly for the Black children that we are serving, it is extremely needed. And I'm very grateful to have, you know, culturally competent master's students who are able to serve their needs right now. Another aspect, however, is that because these kids are signing into counseling at home, oftentimes there may be issues with privacy. So sometimes their parents may be the reason why they are seeking out that counseling. And oftentimes it's a challenge to speak freely in the home, for example. Then there is a concern, which is the main reason why I originally wanted it to be school-based, is internet connection. Not everybody has access to strong internet connection. One of the counselors told me recently, the bulk of the 1 hour counseling session was asking, can you hear me? Can you hear me? And obviously that's not ideal, right? So we're gonna work to send that family an Ethernet cord and hopefully be able to strengthen the internet connection there. But I think generally, I'm very grateful to be able to have pushed ahead and provided the services right now. I got an email from a parent this morning saying that it couldn't have come at a better time. So I'm glad that we're navigating, some of the issues that do come up with receiving counseling at home. And to transition into, one of the questions Julia posed around what can you as alums do to support youth right now? I would list 3 different things. So the first thing I would say is to embrace uncertainty. I think the reality is that right now, as adults, we really don't know much more about what's to come in the future regarding the pandemic than kids do, than youth do. So I think it's okay to say, I don't know, and to really embrace the unknown and to really try to take it one day at a time, as I know all of us as adults are working really hard to do right now. Of course, that's easier said than done to take it one day at a time. So that, leads to my second point, which is as you're helping kids to embrace the unknown and embrace uncertainty, try to create moments of hope. So, hope shows up in the title of this webinar right now. It shows up in the title of my nonprofit, Hopebound. And really that's just because as humans, we all need moments to look forward to keep us going. And hope is different from optimism, because optimism is you're positive no matter what. Hope is you're, looking ahead to the future despite some of the challenges that you may be encountering right now. So whether that is, going for a walk with your child or with youth that you're working with, or, scheduling a call to call grandma, or, baking something new in the kitchen, whatever it may be, trying to create those little moments of hope so kids can continue to look forward to small things throughout the day. And the last thing I'll say is to look for warning signs. And as I mentioned earlier, right now, unfortunately, instances of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation are on the rise. So what I would suggest is if you notice a change in behavior, whether that's related to oversleeping or not sleeping, or overeating or not eating enough, changes in communication, whatever that may be, and if that's persisting for 2 weeks or longer, I would suggest that you speak to that child and look into getting them connected to therapy or someone to speak with, or a counselor that they may have access to. And the last question that Julia posed was, how could you as alums support Hopebound? Well, first of all, it's wonderful that you're all here. It's just great to be able to have this discussion. But I think right now I'm based in Georgia, and then hoping to transition to expanding to California in the fall. So I know many of you are based on the West Coast. If you know of licensed therapists who may be willing to act as supervisors for the master's and doctoral level clinicians, that would be wonderful. Or if you know of schools who may not have budget for a fully licensed mental health clinician, please feel free to contact me afterwards. But I think I hit it all, Julia. Let me know if I missed anything.
The one question that I do have, Christina, is what age group do you either target, or do you have the capacity to serve? How young? And then do they age out of your services when they turn 18?
Yeah, great question. So when I say adolescents, I mean middle school and high school. So that's roughly 10 to 18. However, with some of the families I encountered last month, they had, 8-year-olds and 19-year-olds as well. And I did not turn them away. So in terms of aging out, I do think when they reach the college age, ideally, and if they are in college, ideally they would be able to plug into services there. But in these early stages, honestly, I don't feel a strong need to turn anyone away. But I do focus on that 10 to 17-year-old age bracket, mainly because of how vulnerable adolescents are when it comes to mental health.
Great, thank you. And now, so having touched upon the middle school, high school, I'm going to ask Hal from the class of 64 if he would introduce Chris. So Hal, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll be hearing from Chris about Eastside College Prep.
Thank you, Julia. Full disclosure, I've known Chris for over 40 years. was his AYSO soccer coach, where he rotated from the front line scoring the goals to the back where he prevented them in the goal. And was our son's one of his closest friends. So he doesn't toot his own horn. So let me tell you a little bit about Eastside College Prep and Chris. While he was at Stanford, he did mentor a bunch of kids from East Palo Alto, and then started a more formal program called Shoot for the Stars, which linked his tutoring as a requirement for being able to play basketball and other sports. He realized that he was going to have to go further than that to really have a positive impact on the community. And together with Helen Kim, a classmate of his from the School of Education, Graduate School of Education, Chris started a new school in 1996 with 8 students at a park bench. And it has grown quite a bit since then. This year's enrollment was 270. All those that graduated virtually recently, as their predecessors in the last 20 years, have gone on to 4-year colleges and universities. And excluding their older siblings, these are the first in their families to attend college. So he's really had a great impact on the community. It's a, quote, private school, but no child has ever had to pay a tuition. He has built a dorm where some of them can find solace and study space. Even before the current pandemic, Chris realized that the work of his school was not completed when the graduates go to college, that they need more help, and therefore has been mentoring and helping students as they're in college, as they find internships, as they find permanent employment. So it is a long-term commitment that he is making to the students who go through his school. And since this pandemic has hit, I suspect that some of those services are even more greatly needed, and he will tell us about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hal. I really appreciate your kind introduction and some of the background on the school. And as Hal mentioned, we've learned a lot over the years, and our program has evolved to meet the needs of our students in the community. As Hal mentioned, we started to actually bring a high school back to the East Palo Alto community, since there had not been one there for 20 years, ever since the one public high school, Ravenswood, had closed back in '76. So our original intent was to bring a high school back that would help students to successfully prepare for college. And I think we've learned so much that we spent our first decade or so really trying to develop the strongest high school program that would help our students become the first in their families to go to college. But as Hal mentioned, we've learned over the years that there are so many challenges that our students face once they get to college, and that first generation students face in general, that those of us whose parents went to college can't even imagine. And so with that in mind, we really have extended and decided to take a longitudinal approach with our school to serve not just grades 9 through 12, but really 9 through 16, if you will, and even beyond, to really help students transition successfully into professional careers after college. And so, yes, we served 270 students on our campus. We served just over 400 students at the college level and early professional careers this past year. And we're learning so much, again, every year about how we can better support students at each level. And of course, the pandemic has created a whole nother set of challenges for our students, our families, our alumni, and the community in general. And I know as it relates to the focus of this discussion, I thought I would go into just a little bit about what are some of those challenges that our students have faced. Obviously in March, with the shelter in place, we had to make a quick shift to distance learning, which was a challenge for both our teachers and students. And as Hal mentioned, we've added a number of layers of support over the years, including our boarding program, where we have almost 40% of our students now living on campus. So this was a really abrupt change for our students, not just to have to study at home, but for many of them to have to leave our campus midway, just like students in college. And so our teachers have done the best they could to really make that transition successful, but it's still been a challenge for some students more than others, trying to study and focus away from school, especially given that our model is so dependent on such a personalized approach that I think really helps students to be successful here on campus and even in college. So we've done that, and we've tried to work to get technology needs met by our students, since many of them had issues either with internet connectivity or or with just technology in general. So we've created a program to try to provide students with Chromebooks and Wi-Fi hotspots at home. But it's the hardest part is really figuring out for those students who may have more challenging situations in terms of maybe living in crowded situations at home, just figuring out how they can find a quiet place to focus each day. And that's been a challenge for sure. We finished our spring semester a couple weeks ago. We've started our summer session. Another way that we do support our students is by providing year-round learning. And so all of our, most of our students study on our campus during the summer. But this year we've had to switch that again to continue our distance learning from the spring, which has been especially challenging to welcome our new incoming freshmen into a virtual setting for their first year or first introduction to eSci. But again, we're trying to do the best we can and providing Chromebooks for students and with data plans so that at least the technology piece won't hinder their ability to get started and prepare for their freshman year. But because we're really serving this large community of not just students, but alumni in college and beyond, we've also tried to address the challenges that our college students have faced. You know, when the shelter in place came in March and when colleges shut down, we tried to immediately bring students back who might have been stranded on their college campuses when the dorms closed. But we're seeing that our alumni are facing a lot of different challenges. You know, from first of all, their financial aid packages, maybe, or many of our families have really struggled with lots of situations of families losing jobs over the last couple of months, and really worried about, you know, how that's obviously going to impact the family. And so, you know, one of our concerns is how are students going to continue their education in college? Will colleges offer emergency aid funds that will help offset the differences in family economic situations? And then an added challenge is that our students, it's harder for them to find jobs in the summer, this summer, that will help to pay for their upcoming school year. And so that added stress has been something that we're just trying to help our students in college with as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about our Career Pathways program. And then lastly, I just want to say about our families. So as I mentioned, our families are really dealing with a lot of challenging situations now. And so we've tried to address that by really extending the services that we already offer our students and families. We tried to address the need right away in March by creating a dinner program where we're serving 1,000 meals a week. And we've been doing that for the last 4 months for dinners to really help families, and also working with families to connect them with local agencies and support groups in the community, so that they can have a better sense of what are all the resources that might be available and helpful to them during this really time of crisis for so many of our families. So that's a little bit of kind of what we've been trying to do in terms of immediately trying to address the needs of our students, families, and alumni. I also think to just piggybacking off of all the good work that Christina is doing, you know, we've seen in general an increase in mental health concerns among many of our students and alums over the years, and especially now in this time when you have the added stress for all the reasons I just mentioned, and the fact that a lot of our students have really benefited from the resources, the mental health resources, either on their college campuses or at Eastside, that when you remove them from those campuses, some of those resources then are harder to be accessible to them. So we've tried to connect students with at least remote mental health services that would help them and help their families during this time as well. And then, so again, really appreciate the opportunity to not only be here today, share a little bit about Eastside, but also about how alums could get involved or be interested in trying to help students in our situation. And one of those key ways is that we've really, again, our scope and goals of the school have evolved over the years. And so much of our focus now is on helping students really prepare for careers after college. And so we started, as part of our school, a Career Pathways program, which works with students starting as early as 10th grade in high school, all the way through college. And the goal is really to help, first of all, expose students to various career pathways and help them prepare for them while they're in high school and college. And this is really such an important part of our overall school program. since our students are the first in their families to go to college, they'll also be the first to enter the professional world. And so they're just not aware of the vast set of opportunities that could be available to them as much as many of their peers in college. So, we're always looking for opportunities for volunteers to help. And we have a number of different opportunities, both at the high school level with our Career Pathways program. We have everything from a career incubator days where we bring in volunteers to talk about their career path and to conduct interactive workshops with our students. Senior year, our seniors participate in what we call a career launch program, where we have 7 full days of different workshops where we bring in volunteers from the community to help either with informational interviews, mock interviews. We have a job shadow day where we send all of our seniors off to different companies and organizations for a day in February. And then really the foundation of that program is our internship program, really helping students in college each summer find meaningful work experiences that will really help them have a better sense of what they might want to do after college and to really help start to prepare for those careers. And so, I think that's, and of course, this summer is another, one of the many challenges is that those opportunities have dried up for the most part. And so we've tried to address that by finding other ways that students could continue to at least develop their professional skills short of having an internship. But in general, again, any opportunities to connect our students and just to share your experiences can be incredibly, make a tremendous difference for our students as they have a chance to learn more about the various careers that might be out there. So anyways, that's a little bit about some of the challenges that we're going through now and how we're trying to address them. But again, really thank Hal for inviting me and to be part of this morning discussion.
Thank you, Chris. And that's a great segue actually to Claire, who has started an organization called The Arena. So Claire.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here. And Christina and Chris, you have also been incredible colleagues and mentors. And so I'm excited for this to be an ongoing conversation. I was a member of the undergrad class of 13 and then the GSE and GSB 18 and have, I think, been able to do this probably only because of Stanford's support. So I'm glad to be here. So the Arena Inc. is a national organization that's a nonprofit based in the Bay Area. And we connect schools and industry partners to ensure that youth ages 17 to 25 can build reliably stable lives. And reliably stable, imperfect, but we think about you being upwardly mobile in your mid-20s in a median income career. And we care about filling the gaps between high school, college, and work because it's often the transition points where youth tend to fall through the cracks. And the reason I went back to grad school was because I had found that the college persistence and workforce connectedness issues were very real. So the California dashboard this year, I checked yesterday, says that like 48% of students graduating from high school this year are college ready. So the state is saying that only half of students that are graduating are ready for a post-secondary option. Many more than that population are attending college, many drop out. And more often than not, it's a story like it took you 7 years to earn an associate's degree, which is a 2-year degree. You accrue a bunch of debt. More often than not, the majority is a population that has earned some credit and no degree and accrued a bunch of debt, psychological harm, and disconnection from the workforce. So I think in general, to set the stage, schools like Chris's are incredible and the exception, not the norm. And so what I started to find was, even if we believe that a 4-year bachelor's degree from a selective school is the most valuable insurance plan, the reliability of that option is fairly low for the majority of the students that we serve. And this also felt very real. I used to be a high school math teacher and a school administrator at a public high school in New Orleans. And our kids were incredible. They came in at a second grade or third grade math or reading level and graduated, quote, college ready more often than not, and then proceeded to flail once they left. And that was kids getting full rides to liberal arts colleges, all the way to kids who were struggling to even graduate from high school, were facing microaggressions on campus, couldn't find the financial aid office, had to help mom, someone in their family was sick, they had to go home. The list goes on of needing to manage a ton of different responsibilities. And in general, if you are a person of color and if you are poor, the deck is stacked against you. And so I was in school trying to kind of figure out what alternative pathways looked like, what different interventions in workforce development looked like, and then hearing time and time again, anecdotally, students struggling. And so our organization thinks about the ways in which we can create connectivity between schools and employers, because what Chris is doing is incredible, and again, the exception, and it's a huge, I imagine, operational lift to coordinate internships, to pull in different people, to be career advisors, to create more exposure, all the things that we know are incredibly important. I have been trying to think about, like, what are the different ways we can spotlight what organizations are doing and be a coordinator so more of this can happen at scale for our youth. So what our organization does is two different things, one of which is work with institutions and one of which is work with youth. So with institutions, we think about our stakeholders as K-12 institutions, which are charter school networks or districts that are the supply of talent. So that's current high school students, that's alumni, and that's parents. The second group is training providers. So we work with online training that we think of as a conduit between school and work rather than a degree being an end in and of itself. And then the third group is employers. So we work with companies in 5 different industry areas: healthcare, education, IT, manufacturing, and business. And these are companies that have diverse workforces, higher entry-level talent, have pathways upward, and livable wages. And then the fourth group is affiliated funding and policy organizations. So any other org in the ecosystem that is trying to support this work. And our B2B channel is really just simply embedded partnerships. So we are a professional matchmaker. Right now, a couple examples of that are West Contra Costa School District is partnering with an online IT and business learning platform, is partnering with a couple different employers that are Workforce Board affiliated in the Bay Area. And this was really in response to summer internships shutting down and schools wanting to be able to step up to help students. And another couple examples are, I'm working with a state government on the East Coast, and we have a few different healthcare pilots, each of which has a K-12 partner to supply alumni and parents as users of this program, an online training that's doing a patient care technician and certified nursing assistant accelerated pathway, and a couple different healthcare employers that will embed the clinicals and hire direct graduates of the program. So the partnership model is, the idea really is that doing kind of deep dives into these organizations and developing thin and lean partnerships and the connectivity allows for us to build the right proof points and then pull up on those pilots and talk about the models and make a case for scale. And we've come to this model because I strongly believe that there is a need for a coordinating partner. Each respective institution cares deeply about the health of youth. And also, like, that's not the thing that keeps them up at night. They have a ton of other things that they're worried about. And so coming in as a third party and being able to be agile enough to go between different industries and broker partnerships and set up the right sort of program implementation and support that meets each of these institutions' needs has really allowed us to think about how do we do this in a kind of deep way with a few institutions, and then think about rolling that out elsewhere so there's just more fluid pipelines and pathways so that our youth don't fall through the cracks. The second set of services is a product that we are building directly for and by and with youth. And it's essentially a shopping website. So it's a database of online training providers. So all the online training providers that we work with and many others are the conduit between school and work, or schools and employers. And then they're on this site and students can evaluate them across central metrics like cost, financing options, industry outcomes, entry-level jobs and starting salaries that they might want. And it's been interesting, I think, to tie this a little bit back to the current moment. The alternative higher ed landscape was shifting a lot even before COVID. And I think I had found that often it felt Sisyphean to try to sell online options to schools and to companies, because often there's this perception that either it's a University of Phoenix predatory institution or it's a coding boot camp. And it's like one of two extremes and there's sort of nothing in the middle. And the reliance, or the sort of forced reliance on online during COVID has really allowed for us to change the narrative a little bit and think about how do we use online training as a tool with the right sets of wraparound supports and the right adult accountability. But that there's so much more color in the space than we'd imagine. And so we're learning a lot with that, and then layering on editorial content. So things like, top 5 programs to do if you want to complete an industry recognized credential in 5 months, or if you want to become a central sterile processor in healthcare, how might you enter into that path? Or one student's alternative path and how they decided to work through college and do an online degree. So I think we're trying to think about how to elevate the narrative. And during a time when like COVID didn't shift our mission or our model, it just amplified it. I think when a vulnerable population enters a pandemic, they are more disproportionately hit, obviously. So access to education, access to healthcare, access to good jobs, all experienced disproportionately by youth of color and in marginalized, impoverished communities. And it's a lot of the stuff that Chris was also talking about, like families now can't meet expected family contribution to go to college. Students don't want to pay to go to an online community college or CSU. Often, their summer internships were canceled. That's a great way for them to earn an industry recognized credential and pad their resume or start to be able to work during college. Or, now that gap years might be a ton more prevalent, what are different ways that they can be working and upskilling at the same time? I think this is definitely an opportunity to amplify our work because there is an amplified need. And obviously the long overdue spotlight on race and inequity in our country that the recent killings and protests have illuminated is even more reason to do the work. I talked to one of my favorite former students the other week, and he is a genius and right now is working in a granite yard. He dropped out of college to help his mom pay for her nursing degree. He then started working as an electrician, and his shop closed during COVID because it couldn't make enough money. So he got the best job he could find. And now he hasn't been paid for 3 weeks because the admin who administers payment is out because she has COVID. And just like a very acute example of an incredibly capable student who didn't even want to talk to me about the protests because he was sort of like, this is my life every single day. It's always been my life every single day. And as evidenced by all of the adversity that I'm facing right now. So I think to me, it's the past several months have been a reminder that the work we do is really important. And sometimes it's not about shifting, it's just about like stepping up and leaning in during a time like this. So I'm really grateful to be here. And I think I wrote a letter that I put on Medium. I'd never write anything, but I tried to push myself to think about this moment as a way to invite more employers in. We work with really incredible employers. And also we've been turned away from a lot of employers that say, we already hire an intern from Europe, so we're good, or, you know, like we have other things to do, and aren't thinking about our overlooked talent as a really important talent pipeline. And so I think there are things that we can think about right now to invite people in and to task people with a lot of power to join the conversation or remain in the conversation. And so I'm glad to be here. I think that I would love to learn what all of you are doing and how you have experienced the past several months. And for our students and our organization, I think what is most helpful is reaching out to share what you are doing or to inquire about partnership, to refer other institutions that you are a part of or that are in your network, whether they be K-12s, training providers, or employers, to work with us if they want to work with us more deeply, to fund projects, because often we help institutions that we work with find funding because we never want cost to be a burden. Anything like that to get engaged. And I think speaking up and making sure that, you know, you're thinking about whether you're in a position to hire or you are employed, and so you work with people who hire, thinking about what the decisions are of the HR and talent teams of institutions, whether you're directly related or whether you can put pressure on them to hire right now, to think about short-term programs and opportunities. And if it feels like that's really far away, to reach out to us so we can learn from you and support you in doing that. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And Jenna, I know that impact experience affects communities and organizations that even transcend youth. So if you could first just talk about impact experience overall, and then dive in more closely on a recent project that I know that your organization addressed, which was the Steve Fund. But first, provide the overall of what you do.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia. And it's really wonderful to be with all of you here today. So our work at Impact Experience is really focused on building bridges between funders, entrepreneurs, innovators, and marginalized communities. And we're particularly focused actually through a research partnership that we have with Stanford around implicit bias and the lack of capital that is invested into women and people of color. So we see that less than 2% of investments are invested into women and people of color. So we've worked in about 30 communities and engaged about 900 people across the country to really look at what are these ways that we can build bridges to unlock capital and partnerships. And we also do internal work within organizations that are looking at questions around biases and structural racism. And so we found just more broadly in terms of particularly over the past few months with everything with both COVID and the more recent sort of focus around Black Lives Matter, the increased orientation of different groups to be thinking about some of these questions that we're engaged around on this call, and more broadly in terms of how do we think about the most marginalized people within our communities, and one of those groups being most acutely, you know, young people of color. And so I can talk a bit more about some of our work, particularly with the Steve Fund. I'll also mention in terms of this broader work around bias and structural racism, actually next week we're hosting a more GSB focused impact experience, and we'll be doing a series of these, and we have about 30 alumni that have signed up for that. Actually the dean will be joining as well for that. And I think that it's a really important time and lens, both as it relates to the conversation that we're having today, but also more broadly in terms of how do we realize within the organizations that we're part of the the role that biases and structural racism is playing, and what are some of the tools that we can develop to engage around that. And that was a big part of the motivation for us in building this partnership with the Steve Fund. And the Steve Fund is focused particularly on mental health of young people of color. And they are an incredible nonprofit organization based out in New York. And they have designed interventions to work particularly in supporting young people of color who are transitioning from high school into college. And as has been alluded to, and Christina mentioned earlier, you know, we've seen an increase. I was just reading, there was a research paper that came out earlier this week from the Congressional Black Caucus that we've seen an increase by 73% in the self-reported suicide attempts by Black teens. So when we think about that as an issue, and particularly, as has been mentioned, as the support systems that people may have had within schools that now being more isolated, the need right now for interventions and support systems to engage youth of color at this time. So part of the focus of our work with the Steve Fund was looking at what is the role of technology, and this was sort of pre-COVID, but it had become even more acute in terms of everything with COVID, of how do we use technology to be able to kind of deepen this work with young people of color. And so we had, for example, in our group, somebody from Cisco, and looking at how do we build off like large technology companies. And we're seeing this a lot more recently in terms of the commitment that large technology companies are wanting to make in terms of taking a stance as it relates to, you know, questions around bias and structural racism, but being able to use the tools that are at the disposal to be able to support ecosystems and engagements, particularly with young people of color. There was another company that was part of our group, Sibley, that have developed a text service. And I know that we also have another alumni, Ashley Edwards, who built MindRight and who also has a text service. But Sibley similarly will enable young people, and particularly young people of color, to engage with therapists through text services. So in looking at some of these interventions and like what are ways of being able to scale some of the work. And one aspect that was both core to our work with the Steve Fund engagement, but also more broadly, is the power of this intergenerational engagement. So we had, for example, in our group, a gentleman, Arnold Perkins, who's on the board of the California Wellness Foundation, and they've been doing a lot in terms of particularly funding research and interventions, and in collaboration with Kaiser here in the Bay Area, looking at interventions, you know, focused on young people of color. But having somebody like Arnold Perkins, who is in his mid-70s, with a young person in the group who's 19 years old, African-American, has 3 kids. And what Arnold was saying as part of this engagement was the power of being held and holding space for one another. And I think this is even more acute in this time. And in terms of what each of us can do, I think is realizing actually just the power of our presence and investing that engagement and that time in building those relationships, particularly given the increase in this feeling of isolation and loneliness, that realizing that like reaching out and the power of creating those spaces for people to be able to process and engage. And we have been doing these intergenerational virtual impact experiences, and you can see particularly the young people that are engaging in these virtual experiences, who are craving just spaces to be able to process and feel as though, you know, there are others out there both like them but also different to them, who are navigating these times and being able to share resources and tools about what's working, you know, what people are struggling with in that process. We also had in our group the head of institutional equity from Duke, who talked a lot about Professor Ben Rees, sharing about like the systemic issues that exist within the education systems that have perpetuated these challenges, you know, particularly as it relates to access to counseling support for young people of color, the role of, and when as people are graduating and then looking to navigate the job workforce, that it continues to perpetuate these challenges over time. And so being able to look at And there are a number of these resources, and we've been doing some work with Twigo Foundation, for example, that is particularly focused on helping young people of color access jobs. And this is within the venture capital industry, but being able to look at how do we support people throughout their whole life cycle. So even as they're graduating, and particularly now with the challenges in terms of the lack of access to jobs, being able to look at what are the mechanisms for navigating those jobs. So that's another sort of call to action, is for both those of you who might be hiring or looking at or part of networks of the people are hiring, being intentional about recruiting young people of color in particular, and having a strategy around the thoughtfulness around that as being a really powerful way in this time to be able to engage around some of the topics that we're working on. So appreciative of the opportunity to connect with you all, and excited to dive deeper.
So now I propose that we go straight to interactive live questions, and we'll just take them as long as we have them. So any questions, reactions, comments to the panel? Carol? There.
My question is to Chris, to either of the women, if they wish to reply. Have the protests of late and their depth and seriousness changed much for your students?
Yeah, for our students and our alums, it's been, I think many of our students and alums have been active in some of the protests as a way just to, but there's no question that it's, I think what we're seeing in the last couple of weeks has been what many of our students have been experiencing for their lives. And so, but I do think that we're trying to find ways, and in fact, we've had several calls with trying to organize our students, but also our alumni to really be of support for each other. And so we started several discussion groups and book studies as well, but also working about how our alums in particular can feel kind of a sense of agency of how they can go about, with action to hopefully help with the changes that need to be made. And so, but it's definitely been a real, I think, challenging time, obviously emotionally for our students, their families, but at the same time, it's something that I think they, been encountering their whole lives. And so I think there's a sense of potential hope that, that all the attention that's being drawn now can actually lead to change. And I think a lot of our alums are trying to drive that with creating these groups among the rest of our alumni to galvanize and to figure out ways that they can get involved. Everything from voter registration and trying to fight the voter suppression, but also looking at how we can engage employers, companies, and college campuses to really help, because it's obviously going to be a societal contribution to this.
Christina, would you like to add what you found your students, how did they react to the most recent weeks, which already were coming on top of COVID? I think you mentioned it, but anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure. So the one thing that's interesting is because of confidentiality reasons and HIPAA regulations, I actually don't interact with the kids directly. But I frequently check in with the counselors, and they kind of give me a general sense without using any identifying information. So about 50% of the students that we're working with are Black. And I believe that from what I've learned, it's been very challenging. As Chris said, this is something that they've been dealing with for their entire lives, and particularly with us being in Georgia. With the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, with the murder of Rayshard Brooks, that's happening right in our city of Atlanta right now. Most of them are in Atlanta. So that has been challenging. And I think there's a little bit of this tension going on that even I'll say I myself have experienced, because it's almost like an awakening that's happening with a lot of people. So it can garner hope, like Chris mentioned, but then there can be a little bit of anger and sadness related to it as well, that the awakening is happening now. So I think that's what's been showing up with some of the youth, but I feel like overall, the feeling is more encouragement than discouragement, and I share in that as well. So I hope that that can be maintained, you know, with the support of people like who are on this call right now.
Right. I also want to add that when you're talking about addressing systemic racism, institutional racism, you know, I mean, legacy, this is not just a problem that, you know, that is short term, it's incredibly complex and entrenched, then it involves so many efforts. And I think that right now, the level of activation and interest in becoming engaged is higher than it's ever been, higher than I've ever seen it. And now, even in particular at the GSB, there are more GSB alums now becoming actively engaged and wanting to be a part of. People who are interested in connecting with the Black Alumni Chapter, the numbers have just mushroomed over this last month. And they're approaching now something like 900 people want to be involved with whatever it is that they're planning. And they have about 700 people on the student, Black Lives Matter for Students. And, you know, again, it went from smaller numbers to just this huge amount of people who want to become involved, become engaged, and want to be also doing something that is really going to make an impact.
And I would just echo this point that both Christina and Julia have mentioned in terms of both the sadness in so many ways that it's sort of, why is it happening now, given that there's been so many of these issues for so long, but also this sense of finally, right? And the idea of being less alone, and all of the work and the challenges of both so many young people and others finally does now have a voice and does have an ability to kind of elevate that, and the desire to use this sort of period of time to actually channel that into very tangible action and ongoing engagement, such that it isn't just great statements that are made, but it's actually shifting in terms of decision-making processes within organizations, the way that they, you know, again, the hiring piece that we mentioned earlier, but board selection, and the actual practical ways in which this can be then channeled into something that's meaningful and sustained over the long term.
Right.
And the only thing I would add also is, from my experience, like, they're tired. Like, this is not new, and there's new attention. So all the things that Jenna and Christina and Chris are saying are true. And I think it does call for more sustained, deep action on part of those who are less tired, and those of us who don't personally experience a lot of the adversity, to continue to step up. And I really do think that a lot of that sustained work happens in employment, in hiring, in promotion, in companies, to increase upward mobility and increase wealth generation and economic freedom. So I know that feels like harder and bigger, but
Yeah.
I think it just calls for more, like, with the sort of more broad awakening, trying, like, if you don't personally experience that adversity, and know that you can't shoulder the burden, there are different things that you can do to honor what that is and to change that moving forward.
Mm-hmm. It could be that these corporate employee resource groups that are often organized by affinity, different kinds, that might be a good channel, because in my experience, most corporations, those groups are starved for resources, starved for volunteers, starved for leadership. You know, they might have an executive champion who, again, has many other things on their plate. So it could even be a way that a person that wants to become engaged and provide some of this mentoring support, or just even guidance for some of these, you know, find a company in your area and help their resource groups. That might be another way of being there and helping. Why don't we just, let's just do one more lightning round just with the panelists to make any one final closing statement, and then we'll finish out for the morning. So let's start, we'll go in the same order: Christina, Chris, Claire, and then Jenna. So Christina, what just closing message would you like to give to us this morning?
Sure. So I would say that youth are our future, and they are really the people that we should be pouring our time and energy and expertise into. And all of us, I believe, on this call are alums. There may be some who are not alums, but just the privilege that we all hold by being Stanford alumni is huge. And I think that being able to really dedicate that to our youth in whichever way makes sense for you to show up, but particularly focusing on those who are most vulnerable. And there are many vulnerable groups, but as we've said many times in this call, youth of color, particularly right now, Black youth, need support. So this is a time to listen, but also really do some inner reflection and think about how you have that unique skill set that can really open up opportunities and really start to, tear down some of the systems that have contributed to this for centuries and rebuild them. And I don't think there's anyone better than, alums of such a prestigious institution to be able to pour themselves into that kind of cause.
Thank you.
And I would say also that, like Christina said, I think that all of us as alums at Stanford have certain privileges that can really help open up doors for others. And I think that, now is more than ever, I think we're seeing some of the glaring disparities and inequities and opportunities, and as it relates to employment, and as Claire mentioned, also just about wealth generation and in terms of economic freedom. And so I think that all of us on this call clearly have an interest in figuring out how we can make a difference and opening up opportunities, whether through your own company or other opportunities, to really continue to stretch it and figure out ways that we can create opportunities for others, and really bridging the gap and for students who haven't had the same opportunities in the past.
Thank you, Chris. Claire?
I think I would like to echo those sentiments as well, and just say, this session is about equipping youth with hope and opportunity. And I think that comes back to, in individual and in institutional ways, showing them that they matter. And I think a lot about expectations and about growth mindset, and whatever your expectations are of somebody, they will meet them. So make sure that they are high. I think if we are treating each other with respect and with love, that is demanding excellence. And so as you think about personal mentorship with the students and youth that and organizations that you're adjacent to that work with youth, and reaching out to us, the sort of small ways that you can affirm them and push them and share your story and bring them in, and get more involved in organizations that are doing that too. I think we sort of slowly chip away at this.
Thank you, Claire. And Jenna?
Thank you. So to echo a lot of what's been said, I'd also mention hope, as many of us think about, is a practice. And I think the intentionality both within ourselves, but also with our engagements with youth, of cultivating that as a practice and as an intentionality around that. And echoing what Christina was saying around particularly Black youth in this time, and kind of recognizing the role that each of us can play in our voices. And as Julia was saying around the employee resource groups, the power of also intersectionality at this time. It's been powerful to see across the country engagements, particularly around Black trans youth, but realizing that we can't see any of these issues in isolation, but rather how each one informs the other. So appreciate being in community with you all, and look forward to being in touch.
Here. And when you say reach out to young people in your life, these could be people that it could be people that you've only crossed paths with once, but continuously to hold that place of availability and then pulling them into activities and things that you're doing to help them feel that they have a place and that they have efficacy, skills, and talents that are needed. And it's I'm realizing just how important that is, and how that's available to each one of us, and who knows the impact that you'll have on the lives that you're touching. So thank you for being here. So thank you for joining us this week, and hope to see you next week.